Kia ora, welcome to our cafe session all about structured literacy and neurodivergent learners. My name is Madeleine Armstrong Wilcox. I'm the head of programs here at the Neurodiversity in Education Project, and we operate the Building a Neuro-Inclusive School program, which is bringing educators like you together so that together we can make our education system more neuro-inclusive. Karakia as we begin. Tu taua mai I ronga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I roto, tu taua mai I waho. Kia tau ai, te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, haumie hui tai kie. A beautiful karakia as it joins us from all of the different places together with this common goal. So today's session and today's recording is a little different sometimes from some of our other cafe sessions. So in our live session, we spent some time together sharing our experiences in implementing a structured approach to literacy. And then from there, making some connections between what we know about structured literacy and how it's working and what we know about neurodivergent learners, and trying to connect those dots to make a structured approach to literacy as effective as possible for all of the brains in our classroom, not just some of them. In today's recording, I'm just going to summarize some of the things that people have said about their experiences with structured literacy and invite you to just reflect, think, jot down notes, doodle, daydream, etc. on your experiences. One of the things I want to point out is that today's session is not about unpacking or defending or diving into structured literacy or a particular program around structured literacy. I'm assuming as a baseline that you have some understandings around the why structured literacy is being implemented, why it is effective, how it's working, and what you're doing. So this session isn't a focus on how are you doing with structured literacy. It's a focus on connecting the dots between what we are doing and what we know about our neurodivergent learners. So thank you for spending time with me talking through these things. They're super important. So in asking teachers what their experiences are so far in implementing structured literacy, some of the big ticks, the things that are going really well, include that structured literacy lessons, no matter the program, so we are not promoting one program or another, but that lessons tended to be fast-paced with kids engaged and active frequently. So use of time and use of energy was really effective. That the structure and routine and predictability of whatever program is being implemented, but those factors around structure and routine and predictability helped everyone. And that is tremendous to hear. I could not agree more. That actually those factors, that high engagement, the structure, the predictability are super supportive for many of our neurodivergent learners. So it's so great hearing from people about how those things are working really well. On the flip side, some of the questions or issues that we heard from teachers around particularly structured literacy for their neurodivergent learners were around anxiety, keeping up with a fast pace. Maybe the pace is moving along regardless of individual child's actual pace. For teachers who are newer to implementing whatever program, structured literacy, sometimes their pace is slower as they get established. So lessons that should take, for instance, 30 minutes, we're taking 45 minutes, which meant that there's kind of flow-on effect on attention and energy for everyone. Some of our students feeling overloaded by the pace, by the volume of learning that is taking place, and some questions around seeing some students passively or actively avoid particular things in structured literacy. Some concerns about finding the Goldilocks zone for learners, that zone of proximal development where things are not too easy and they're not too hard. We know that structured literacy offers a high success model for students, and we want them to be working in that high success zone, but are we making sure we've got actually the ceiling lifted so that those students who are able to achieve more can achieve more, while the floor is solid and certain. So some issues, also some questions around bringing creativity and that beautiful creative spark to our lessons. So I'll just at this point, if you are watching along and you feel so inclined, just hit pause for a few minutes and jot down or reflect on your own thoughts around your experiences so far around structured literacy with a tight focus on your neurodivergent learners. How is it working out for some of them, and how can you tell? So take a minute, hit pause, come back when you're ready. Okay, before we move on and look at connecting the dots between what we know about learners and what we know about structured literacy, I just want to point this piece of greatness out of our new refreshed curriculum, just to highlight that the science of learning and the implications of that in terms of structured literacy and also numeracy. These are laid out in our curriculum in the front section under the heading How Learning Happens. And I think this is a little piece of gold that might be a little hidden, that's worth drawing up to our attention as educators. So the key points in a fairly wordy paragraph is that kids need to feel belonging. Neuro-inclusion, I'll come back to that word in a minute. They need to connect old things to new things in order for learning to stick, and learning being that shift into long-term memory. That the load has to be managed, and I bracket cognitive because it starts well before the thinking takes place. Managing the load is what we need to do for our learners, and that's often the sensory load and the social load before we can tackle the intellectual load, and that we make sure the well-being of our students is front and center as well. Just worth highlighting this little piece of magic. Okay, some of the things we know about our neurodivergent learners, and at this point I just want to take a step back and clarify some key terms that we should be super familiar with, and you will be if you've come to cafe sessions before. Neurodiversity being the idea that all brains are different, and that's magnificent and marvelous and absolutely the norm. And we all need to understand that. And by all, I don't mean all of the teachers, I mean all of the kids. They need to understand that the way their brain is ticking over might be slightly different from the person next to them. And that's great. Like, that's really a cool and exciting thing. So when you have a whole class structured approach to literacy, fantastic, but still with those understandings that my brain and your brain are going to be dealing with this in these different ways, maybe. Cool. That's a great and normal thing. And that neurodivergence is when we are talking about specific brain-based differences definitely with an S, because often we see more than one specific difference in a student, not just this one thing. And that as teachers, we can think about neurodivergence not just in terms of a diagnosis or a formal identification process, that we can actually look at our learners and think about their characteristics and how their brains are working. And we can be great spotters of brain-based differences. We don't have to identify, we don't have to diagnose, we just have to be able to notice, recognize, and respond to those differences. And if you haven't seen our neurodivergent learner characteristics tool yet, I strongly recommend you jump into our website and download it. You can download it for free and spread it around as much as you can. Instead of us talking about neurodivergent learners in terms of here's what you'll notice in autism, here's what you'll notice in ADHD, here's what you'll notice in this and this and this and this and this, we've actually done it a different way and looked at learner characteristics in terms of things you notice in reality in your classrooms, in terms of thinking, what you might notice in terms of kids organizing themselves, what you might notice about how they interact with other people. We've looked at strengths as well as sticking points. Sometimes as teachers, we're great at recognizing sticking points and not so great at the strengths. And then some different ideas to start you off into, okay, well, how do we actually respond to these things? Some ideas for you. So this is our approach to support you to understand your learners and how they are operating. Okay. Even though we're not being driven by diagnosis, we're being driven by characteristics, I do just want to spend a minute in this session unpacking the special case of dyslexia. Seeing as we're talking about structured literacy, we might as well look at some of those brain-based differences that we might notice in particular in this area. So you will know that dyslexia is a brain-based difference. It's not caused by poor teaching. It's not caused by lack of motivation. It's obvious. The brain-based differences can become obvious in toddlerhood, not even at school entry. They become more apparent with instruction, but they can be noticed in toddlerhood. We know that we can do very early screening for dyslexia. And we also know that that very early screening, so for instance, if we did preschool screening for dyslexia, it's going to throw up a whole lot of false positives. So kids that look like they have characteristics of dyslexia, but they probably don't have dyslexia, they just need more intensive or different teaching. That's okay. That those screening things pick up more children than are genuinely dyslexic, because it means that everyone actually gets what they need in terms of the teaching environment. So the two key brain-based differences in dyslexia, as you'll know, is the relative weakness in phonological processing, hearing, manipulating, responding to sounds, and that is a difference in brain wiring. We do know that brains wire to their environment, so that for most children, the connection between sounds and letters is specifically and explicitly taught. But for children with dyslexia, those connections may never actually take hold properly. We'll also know, if you're an educator that's been around for a while, that one of the strategies that was recommended to us as teachers was to help students recognize words through their shape and remember spelling of words through their shape. And those approaches appeared to work with many of our learners and perhaps some of our dyslexic learners, because of this relative strength that our dyslexic learners have. And that's a relative strength in their visual spatial processing, so the parts of their brains that recognize and respond to shapes in space, visual spatial processing are strong. They're biologically wired up to be really great, which is why some of those visual approaches appeared to work. But you will know that explicit teaching around phonological processing, around connecting letters to sound and letter groups to sounds is actually the way to go about teaching kids to read very well. Okay, so just a little dive into dyslexia. You will also know that the gold standard that we are looking for in our classrooms is that all of our brains are recognised, all of our brains are supported in ways that work for them, and all of our brains are celebrated. With that in mind, how do we support differently wired brains in structured literacy? Okay, we have gathered 3 ideas and a few strategies. So if you're a note taker, now's good. Here are our 3 big ideas that will support our neurodivergent learners in structured literacy. One is managing attention and focus. And even though that's a massive strength in structured literacy programs, there are a few other little tweaks we can make around the edges for that. Number 2 is getting the Goldilocks zone around our multisensory input, making sure that those who need more get more, and being adaptive in our teaching rather than the whole class gets exactly the same every day. Adapting to some specific needs is still essential. So let's dig into each of those ideas. And first of all, attention and focus, just about making sure our learners focus on what matters most for this lesson. All right. We know that's up to us as teachers to do. We know that structured literacy across programs, there is fantastic structure to help with that focus. There is fantastic clarity within the teaching program, and that clarity really supports helping our learners focus. And we know that through fast pace and changing between what's going on frequently, we are keeping that attention crisp and focused. So there's already so many great things happening. We'll just share some little tweaks that might support your neurodivergent learners a little bit better. This idea is absolutely critical in terms of attention and focus. That if we think of attention like a torch, and each child has got their attention torch ready to go, for some kids, we have to hold their torch with them. It's not enough just to say, right, here I am, pay attention. We actually very deliberately explain to children what we are doing, why we are doing it, how we are doing it, making sure our instructions are crisp and clear and fast so that their attention stays held with you, with the most important thing that is going on, not where you don't want the attention to wander off to. In terms of the torch analogy, again, we can think of regular torches having a limited battery life. So the torch can come on and shine and you're holding it with the child and it's great. But remember that battery may be able to shine for 5 minutes or 7 minutes or a short time. So when the attention gets to turn off or gets limited, we need to remember that variety in attention across a day or even across a lesson, that you have high points of attention and you have lower points of attention where that brain can just go, just take a minute. I just turn that off for a minute. Just sit quietly. Just change books or grab something out, that lower attention. So making sure there is a variety in the attention load within a lesson and of course across a day. High points and low points. Some of our neurodivergent children who are slow processors, and this doesn't mean they're intellectually slow, it just means that their brains work slowly, not at lightning speed, to process information. For those students in particular, they need those high points and low points because the low points give their brains the time they need to manage the information coming in. Right? If you think of your classroom pace in structured literacy, let's say your pace is at 10 out of 10, but you have some kids in your room whose capacity for that pace is only 5 out of 10. They're either going to get left behind or they're going to get increasingly anxious or worried as the lesson progresses because literally their pace is slower. Not because they're not capable, but just because the pace isn't right for them. So adapting that pace might give them a little bit more space to process what they need. It is important from a sensory perspective that we manage the input that those beautiful little sensory systems are taking in particular the visual input, to limit it to what is important for now, not what is important for every day of the school year. So that what they are seeing is now, needed for now, right now, only right now. I heard it described beautifully as the idea of having a mullet classroom. Business at the front. So this lesson, this is the visual input you need for this lesson, not all of the artwork ever created by everyone, and not every single word in the spelling pattern that was ever written ever in the universe, just this particular small piece of information. Business at the front, party at the back. So all the lovely artwork, all the published loveliness, all the visual junk that we have in a classroom that is great, but that's actually out of sight, out of mind when you are helping children attend to what is most important right now. Okay, next point around attention and focus is spicy practice. And in structured literacy, there's a strong focus on practice, rightly so, brilliant, and it is super supportive. There's some little provisos for some of our neurodivergent kids. Number one, it's a statistic that's bandied around at least that our gifted kids need 2 or 3 practices rather than 7 or 8 or 9 practice events for something to sink in. That is worth just pondering. How do you support some of your kids to have less practice or more varied practice? And that could be as simple as, instead of saying to your class, right, we're all going to write this spelling practice and I want you to write it, spelling pattern, and I want you to write it 5 times. It might be that you say, I want you to write it 5 times, but if you're really confident with it, perhaps use it in different words. Find new words, invent new words that were used on Mars that fit this spelling pattern. So you spice up that practice and you reduce the very strict structured practice. That works very well for those with ADHD brains as well, that their wee brains need something new and different to get that dopamine hit from something different. So spicing up that practice. And that could be with things like, instead of write the sound, say the sound, spell the sound, make it in a word, you could add in some variety in that. Write it in a different color, write it in bubble writing. That slows down the pace for many. Write it in a different way, draw a picture of it. So putting a little bit of extra spice and variety in that practice can really support many of our neurodivergent learners. Okay. The next big area we have is about multisensory input, and it is well established that for learners with dyslexia, that structured literacy may well be a good but no cigar level of practice. So it's absolutely what they need, but sometimes those dyslexic kids need that little bit more, and sometimes we describe that as our tier 2 interventions, and that often includes multisensory input. So making sure that we are doing more with more for our neurodivergent kids in that respect. So it's about finding the perfect combination. No such thing as perfect, so just right. We don't need every learner having all sorts of multisensory input, because that has risk of causing confusion and overwhelm. So this is targeted for those who need it. And some key tips are: be strategic and selective about what input and for whom. So you might be able to peel away a little group of learners for whom you think they would benefit from, let's say, verbalizing or singing spelling patterns as they're working. But if you did that with your whole class, it would be loud and chaotic and just an unnecessary distraction. So maybe you use some of the multisensory strategies in peel away groups. We do know that for dyslexic learners, visual spatial input is a very, very supportive adjunct to structured literacy practice. So make sure that they are writing, drawing, building, making with Play-Doh, painting with paintbrushes, whole body stuff. Make sure they are getting that input. And it may be that you go, well, I don't know who's dyslexic and who's not. That's fine, because we can look at the characteristics. So you might look at your class and go, well, I can see these are some students here who seem to still be struggling, or who are struggling with specific aspects. Maybe I will try out this additional visual spatial strategy in my lesson, but just offer it to a few, not everyone. Okay. But not everything all at once, not for everyone, and not every day. Remember that idea of being spicy with it. This is a really good way of making sure you're putting in a little bit of spice for some, but not all. The Goldilocks zone, the just right input, is likely to change over time. So it probably is not a case of going, oh, I know I have this group of 3 or 4 kids, and I know I'm going to do this, and this is going to work, and that is the end of the conversation. It's more likely that, okay, for the next few weeks, for this week group, I'm going to do this additionally, peel them out, maybe just add these options in, then I'm going to relook at it in a few weeks' time and see what happens. All right, so it's the start of a conversation, always not the end of a conversation. Okay, next strategy is just about being adaptive, responding to that learner variability within your structure. So the baby is not going out with the bathwater. We are keeping that beautiful structure, or whatever structure you're using for your structured literacy, but within that structure, we're being adaptive and responding to variability, with that idea that we can keep in mind that one size fits most, but not all. And I just want to point out again in our curriculum where this is cooked in, because I think this is pretty special as well, that actually we do respond to learner variability. And we respond by making adjustments in our explicitness and our intensity. And I think that's a fabulous wee gem just to keep in mind. Okay, so some ideas for you. Heavy on the respond end of this notice, recognize, respond structure, that we are reading the room really actively. And I know that in implementing structured literacy, many of us as teachers initially, as we're settling in, are very focused on the actual teaching of the program. So we'll have our notes in front of us like this, or our slides, and that's the key focus, making sure we're doing the right things at the right time and in the right way. Absolutely understood. As we settle in, though, we do need to remember that we need to be reading the room. We need to be really aware of the kids who are leaning really heavily on the scaffolding that's provided in a structured literacy lesson. So that's the everybody does, that's the copy from, that's the repeat after me, that's the looking at your neighbor's book, that's all of those things that are happening around a child that they can lean on to be successful. Watch who is leaning most heavily and watch who could be alone in the room and still be doing a brilliant job. All right, so actually noticing who's relying on those scaffolds more or less is a great way to read the room. Remembering that you can always lift the ceiling in your lessons just that tiny little bit. One easy way, perhaps as an example, is to differentiate texts. And I know that in some structured literacy programs, we are all reading the same text at the same time in the same way. I would actually recommend we all read the same style of text, vibe of text, but it's a differentiated text, and we have different AI tools that can help us create those texts that have maybe some common vocab, but differences in complexity. And therefore, we can be differentiating within a whole class lesson where we're still looking at the same vocab, we're still using the same reading skills and bringing those skills to the surface, and we're still relying on our external scaffolds, but at levels that suit us maybe a little differently. We can keep our structure exactly the same all the time, which is great, but pop some flexibility within that structure. And that might be, for instance, in writing, where everyone is using the same structure, but perhaps at different levels, or they have a differentiated topic for writing that might be slightly easier or slightly more complex, or just more spicy or less spicy. Again, you can use a range of AI tools that can help you generate those differentiation bits and bobs. Another way could be making sure that kids could perhaps jump ahead in your structure. So if you have a really great structure of say its name, say its sound, spell it, write it, use it in a sentence, etc. Instead of, if you have some kids that are, they're just go, 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 could they just go, 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 go? Do they have to wait for the instruction, name, sound, spell, write, use? Can they just flow on through? There are easy tweaks you can make in those respects as well. It's just about knowing how your kids are responding and how they are leaning or not leaning on that scaffold. Okay. There's in many structured literacy programs, there's a good focus on those building those supportive peer interactions, which is fantastic. We can teach social skills through that, right? Really easily. Things around tune taking, active listening, etc. can be useful scaffolds for many of our kids, but in particular, many of our neurodivergent learners. But we hear consistently from neurodivergent kids themselves that they have a very strong preference for working with close in skill peers, not distant in skill peers. So making sure that when you are setting up those peer groupings, for lack of a better word, that those groupings are close in skill. You're not pairing up people who are very, very distant. That is a clear preference that comes from our neurodivergent learners themselves quite consistently. That may mean that across the day and across lessons, kids are sitting in different places, or their peers are being mixed up. So I sit by Johnny for spelling work, and I sit by Timmy for writing work, and I sit with someone else again for maths work, which is a different structure, but it's still a predictable structure if you make it so. And that ensures those close in skill are genuinely close in skill in different areas. Takes a little bit more work, but it is a great way to be adaptive. Okay. As we near the end, one thing I'd really like you to do is just take a minute and think about your structured literacy and your neurodivergent learners, and make a little note of one little thing you might try out in your classroom, and stick it on a post-it if that works for you. Try it out tomorrow. See what happens. Be adaptive. If it doesn't work, no harm, no foul. Try something else. As we are finishing up also, if you have your phone handy, hit pause, grab your phone, scan the QR code and leave us some feedback. It's really important to us that we hear from you. We don't need you to write a novel in feedback, 2 or 3 questions, and it really helps us understand how we can support you, what you are after, and how you are finding these sessions. So hit pause, send us some feedback. Much appreciated. We can come to you if that is something your school would like, for one of our team to come to your school and chat with your team about neuro-inclusion, share some strategies and ideas. Get in touch with us. Here's our email address, or check out the resources on our website. And a karakia as we finish up. Ko mutu a mātou mahi mō tēnei wā, manaki tia mai mā katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, ao ki te aorangi. Thank you all for spending some time thinking about structured literacy and how that is playing out for your neurodivergent learners. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.